and always know you could feel beauty rising.
Hi, my name is Sue Skaski with Vermont Volunteer Services for Animals Humane Society, and welcome to our show, For the Animals. In the recent weeks, an important issue that's been discussed in the newspapers, coming to the forefront once again, has been frustrating for very many Vermonters. And it's with regard to a policy under the Fish and Wildlife where fawns that are in need of assistance, the policy is to shoot them. So if you call for help, a game warden will come and destroy them. We welcome Julia Gresser, Nancy Carey, and Donna Norton to the show today to talk about this topic. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Nancy Carey is a returning guest and has been a licensed mammal wildlife rehabilitator in Vermont since 1992. She specializes in raccoons, skunks, fox, and woodchucks. They're rabies vector species?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you for having me.
Donna Norton lives in Starksboro, Vermont, and became a licensed wildlife rehabilitator in 2003, working primarily with fawn and then black bear cubs until 2 years ago.
That's right.
Thank you, Donna.
You're welcome.
And Julia Westervelt Gresser, who lives in Marshfield and maintains a psychotherapy practice in Montpelier, Vermont, is involved in this issue as well. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. We're hoping to do a two-part show on this because it is a very involved topic. So, the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department has suggested that if people simply leave fawns in the wild, there's no need to have a rehabilitation program. And the fact is that fawns can truly be orphaned. The does do get hit by cars, leaving their young motherless. And fawns are injured in a variety of other ways as well. Not able to get help when you need assistance with an animal, it's just simply wrong. And I know that this is a political lightning rod and multifaceted, so let's get it all out in the open. After all, the Fish and Wildlife is the state, and the state works for us. Okay. Nancy, can you give us a brief history of rehabilitation in Vermont with regards to animals in general?
Well, to take care of any wild animal, you have to have a license. And that includes fishing licenses and hunting licenses, and caring for a wild with the intention of putting them back into the wild. So you have to have a permit to do that, and some permits are specialized. You need a state permit and a federal permit if you're going to do any birds, and including waterfowl. You need a special permit to do game animals and a special permit to do rabies vectors.
Where do you learn, by the way?
That is up to you. There's plenty of resources out there. There's conferences, there's basic training, there's written resources. You can apprentice. We have an apprentice program in Vermont. You can apprentice with a licensed rehabilitator. And so there's lots of different sources that you can get information.
Okay. Julia, can you tell me your story with regard to the fawn whose life you saved and the exchanges between yourself and Commissioner Berry?
Sure. I'm completely new to this topic, and it's been wonderful to meet some of the wildlife rehabilitators and community in Vermont. And I just kind of stumbled into this at the end of May. On about May 30th, my neighbors, who are long-term Vermont residents, took a walk in their woods and found a dead doe with a full udder. And the next day they heard some fawns crying, and they went into the forest and found one fawn and then later another fawn. And the fawns were bleeding and crying, and they could hear them from their house. So they called the state police dispatcher and to find out information about what they could do, and the state police dispatcher told them that if they called Fish and Game, that the fawns would be shot. So they really had no recourse, they felt, but to just leave the fawns there. And on that Sunday, which was about June 2nd, there was a really tremendous storm in the Marshfield area, and hundreds of trees came down in a period of about 20 minutes, some of them landing on my neighbor's car. So my husband and I were over there cutting trees and trying to help them with their house and yard. And my neighbor, Jean, told me that this very, very sad thing was happening, which was that these fawns were starving to death in the woods. And she and her husband could do nothing about it and were just listening to them cry day and night. And I just, being the person that I am, I just said, take me to them, show me where you found them. And on the way she told me that, you know, the story that she was told that all Fish and Game would do is come out and shoot them, and she didn't want that to happen. So I looked in the woods, which were covered with down trees, and we gave up after a while searching for them, but then one of them started crying out, and I returned to the woods, and because the one fawn was crying, I was able to find it. And I just picked it up and brought it back to my house, and immediately started calling wildlife rehabilitators, whose names I was given by my neighbors, and asking what do they need, and what does this fawn need to live. And I learned that it needed goat's milk and got it a bottle, and started trying to find out how I could get it to a wildlife rehabilitation center. And it was the beginning of an odyssey for me. As I was taking care of this fawn for the following week, we kept it in a straw bed on our covered porch so that it would be safe from predators, and fed it every 2 hours during the day and the evening. And it thrived and was doing beautifully and was just a beautiful, healthy young animal. And but I very quickly discovered that there's a lot of difficulties with getting a fawn like this to a protected place. And the licensed rehabilitation community people let me know that they were not allowed, because we live in Vermont, we were not allowed to rehabilitate fawns, that the Fish and Game Department would find me and they would come out and they would take the fawn. And so I very quickly, there was one rehabilitator who thought that because the law in Vermont allows rehabilitation and allows there to, basically there's a policy in Vermont at the discretion, I guess, of the commissioner, who is Patrick Berry. The policy is to kill fawns, not allow rehabilitation. The law actually does allow rehabilitation. So that was confusing to me.
That's interesting.
And I tried to work with this one rehabilitator who thought that there might be a way to get permission for this fawn to go to rehabilitation, which I thought would be the best thing. I am a law-abiding citizen, and I wanted to do this in a law-abiding way, if at all possible. But I was also told that there was a good chance that Fish and Game would not allow this, and that that Fish and Game would try to find the fawn and shoot it. So I discovered that there are people in places where you can find a way to take, it is possible to find a way to get a fawn out of the state of Vermont and into any of the surrounding states that will rehabilitate it, because the states all over New England, except for Vermont, allow the rehabilitation of fawns. So I was also working on that plan. That was option B. And by the end of the week, it looked like we might have to go with option B. And I had made arrangements for that. But while my husband and I were out away from our home briefly on Saturday morning, the Fish and Game Department arrived. My neighbor Jean was there because she had just fed the fawn. And the Fish and Game officer knocked on my door. I was not home. And he walked around my property until he discovered the fawn on a back covered porch. And he went up on the porch. My neighbor Jean said to him, "Do you have a search warrant?" He said, "No." She said, it's not legal, is it, for you to go up on her porch?" And he said, "No, it isn't, but I'm going to do it anyway."
Oh.
And he took the fawn, and after several hours, he shot the fawn. In the meantime, my husband and I came home. I got on the phone with him, obviously did everything I could to change his mind. He referred me to his supervisor. I called his supervisor. I basically went up the chain of command to several different people. imploring each one of them that there was a better way, there was a different way, that this fawn did not have to be killed. It was a perfectly healthy, beautiful fawn, and there were people who were willing to take care of it and eager to take care of it. And I was told by every one of them, going up the chain of command, that this is a policy that Vermont has and that there's nothing they can do about it, and they don't necessarily even agree with it, but it's their job to carry out the policy. And each of them referred me to the next person up the chain of command. And but ultimately, after an hour of trying to negotiate, you know, I was told that there was nothing else that could happen, and the fawn would be shot. And so it was a very sad, obviously a very sad thing. And I just decided at that point that if there was nothing I could do to influence the Fish and Game Department, that I would try to at least tell that story to the general public and see if there might be other people who had had similar experiences and who wanted to see a change.
And did you write it? Were you
So I wrote,
interviewed?
yes, I wrote basically what I've just said to you. Mm-hmm. I wrote in a letter to the editor. It was published as an op-ed in the Times Argus and the Rutland Herald, and that began then several articles in which Patrick Berry was interviewed as well.
I found it interesting in the Rutland Herald article that covered this, that it was titled "Vermonters Not Fond of Fawn Policy." Mm-hmm. I mean, that really, when you talk to people, mm-hmm. and I'm talking hunters across the board, general people, nobody seems to like this mm-hmm. policy. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But do you know, did the officer identify themselves, the game warden?
I know who the officer is who shot the fawn. Mm-hmm. I had a long talk with him. I called him a couple of days after the fawn died. And I've chosen not to share his name because he told me that it was a terrible experience for him, and I believe him. And I don't think that it's really about him as a person. Mm-hmm. I think the fish and game officers are caught by this policy too. Some of them may agree wholeheartedly with it, and some of them may not, but I don't think it really has to do with the particular fish and game officials, that it's more the policy of the people at the top in the department, and possibly the biologists in the department, I don't know. But I just haven't wanted to make it about this particular fish and game officer.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a heart-wrenching story.
Yeah.
Emotionally,
it's really sad.
Draining,
mm-hmm.
frustrating. You must, especially as a psychotherapist, it's got to be so.
You know, it's
conflicting.
And I've been careful not to talk much about the emotion that was involved in this, because I don't want to just be seen as a bleeding heart. And I know that the people in the Fish and Game Department have to think about the whole herd, and they have to think about the greater good and all that. But I believe that every life does matter. This fawn's life was not inconsequential.
And I think when we lose that measuring stick, every life
yeah.
does matter.
Yeah. And you know, it really was. It was a healthy, vibrant animal with a strong will to live, and it just seemed so senseless. And I've talked to other people who've had a similar experience too, mm-hmm. and it's been very difficult for the people involved, as well as obviously for the fawn.
Okay, I have a question. Tell me if it's accurate. In one of the articles, the commissioner says if people refrain from snatching wild animals, and I quote, from their natural environment, that there wouldn't be a problem with orphaned fawns. Is this accurate? Donna, can you answer that?
Yeah, absolutely not. There are fawn who are orphaned because their mothers are hit mm-hmm. by cars. There are fawn that are injured because they either run into a car. Mm. People's dogs will sometimes bring a fawn in, and that fawn needs care. There could be bites, there could be cuts, and even in the article that you showed us before, this fawn fell into the falls. I had a fawn come into rehabilitation that had fallen into a crevice and was rescued by game wardens. So that is absolutely not true. There will always be fawn that need to have care and need to be in a rehabilitation program.
And you just talked about this. This was in the Mountain Times. Okay, and it's so contradictory to what we're talking about. Now, I'd like to share this. I hadn't planned on sharing it, but I think it's important. The title is, Police Join Forces with KSAR to Rescue a Deer Trapped at Thundering Brooks Falls in Killington. On Friday, July 12th, Chief of Police Whit Montgomery received a phone call from Killington resident Andrew McKenna reporting a trapped fawn stuck at Thundering Brook Falls. Upon arrival, Montgomery was greeted by McKenna, who led Montgomery to the deer. The deer was stuck in a crisscross brush at the bottom of a large ravine. Montgomery then notified dispatch, who notified the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Due to the deer's proximity to the hiking trail, Montgomery decided an attempt should be made to assist the fawn in moving. If the fawn stayed there, it could cause a hazard to both the hikers and the fawn. Hikers who tried to assist or feed it could get injured due to the location and also inadvertently harass wildlife. Montgomery called the Killington Search and Rescue, KSAR, who specialize in high-angle rope rescue. Co-founder and chief of KSAR, Robert Giolito, responded with the proper equipment and rappelled down to the fawn. He was able to free the fawn and guide it down the 3 tiers to a safer location down the falls. Large wooden planks were then borrowed from McKenna and set up to allow the fawn to escape. However, Saturday morning, July 13th, Montgomery received a call that the fawn was still there. It was then decided that McKenna would turn on the generators to slow down and lower the water level of the falls. Within an hour of the water level receding, the fawn was able to cross the wooden planks and escape. Montgomery stated, quote, "It's nice when citizens, volunteer organizations, KSAR, and law enforcement come together and work as a team for a common good." Good for you. Good for you and everybody who sees an opportunity to help and make something right, even though others,
Right.
General, say, no, you can't. I mean, you have to make a decision in life. You have to make a decision in life. Are you going to be, you know what I mean to say.
Are you going to turn your back on a living creature, a beautiful living creature,
Right.
or are you going to do what you can to help?
Right.
And they chose to help.
Yeah,
And Vermonters want to help.
absolutely. Okay. Nancy?
And that should be against the law is kind of shameful,
Right.
Disheartening too.
really.
But it's interesting what you said, though, that the law reads one way and the policy reads another. So maybe what they did was not against the law.
Yes. Well, it would have been if they had kept the animal,
Okay.
and wanted to care for it. Luckily, it seems like there was a doe around, and so that fawn was able to go. But what about the fawn whose mother had fallen down there and had died down there?
Right.
There would have been no recourse, no living recourse for that little fawn. It would have been shot.
Well, Nancy, is there a problem with fawns being inadvertently orphaned by people? And how do you draw a line as to what animal is rescued and what is left to die? And that old let nature take its course.
Well, we call it kidnapping. So if somebody comes across a fawn in a field and it's laying still and there is no dead doe around, then it's best to assume that mom is there. She leaves her baby because it's protected better that way. She's not drawing attention to it. She comes back to nurse it and she goes off and browses by herself. And as that baby grows, then he's able to follow her, and then that's when you see them with the doe. But just to find a fawn laying in the field does not indicate that it's been orphaned.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
How long can they leave the fawns?
That's a good question. I just found out that a fawn in Massachusetts, where they allow wildlife rehabilitation of fawns, was separated from its doe for 4 days, and they managed to get it back to the doe, and she was still lactating. So that was a successful rescue, and reunion with its mom.
So, but if a doe goes out, normally
Hours.
Hours.
It can
okay.
be hours. One way to tell if an animal needs assistance, and this is all animals, not just fawns, but if it's in harm's way, it's in the middle of a road or a parking lot, if it's got a wound, if there's flies on it, or if there's a dead mother, a dead doe, then that animal needs some intervention. So that's the way we determine what we should do about it and whether it needs our assistance or not. We ask the public to go through those criteria when they're looking at a wild animal before they intervene. Obviously, if you need to get the animal out of harm's way, do it without handling it barehanded. Use gloves. If you have nothing else with you and you're in your car, you've got a car mat. So scoop the animal off of the road and then call us and let us know that it's there so that we can help you discern what to do about that animal.
Thank you. Donna, you did rehabilitation for fawns for many years.
That's right.
What were the reasons that fawns were accepted into your rehabilitation program?
I actually only had a chance to do it for 2 years. I started in 2003 and in 2004. And then 2005 was when the state prohibited fawn rehabilitation. So I did it for 2 years. I looked back at my phone log, and I found that I had calls about 32 different fawn in those 2 years. 7 of those fawn were reunited back to their mother, and with follow-up calls that had happened. 21 were accepted into the rehabilitation program. And 6 of those were orphaned because their mother had been hit by cars, and 14 were injured for different reasons. 1 was confiscated late in the summer by the Fish and Wildlife. And 10 of those were released into the wild and were seen at different times. We'll talk about that more later, but they were seen at different times after release.
Okay, Donna, I know that Commissioner Barry has cited studies in which fawn died upon release within 30 to 60 days, regardless of how they were released. I know the fawns are rehabbed in our surrounding states, and that this statement is contrary to statistics. What have you experienced?
That's an absolutely untrue statement. Fawn can be rehabilitated. They do not necessarily die when they are released. I soft release the fawn that I work with.
What does that mean?
Soft release means you basically open the enclosure door and the fawn are released into the wild. I live in a place that I can do that. And for weeks after the fawn have been released, I continue to put out their bottles and can tell that they are coming for them. I don't always see them, but I can tell the bottles have been are gone. The milk is gone. And that continues into probably September, at which point fawn will stop nursing in the wild, and these just stop coming to the feeder. But then I see them under apple trees, just around. I live in a place where I would see them. And I have very good observations of them living well into the winter and into the following year, at which point I lose track of them because they become more wild and I can't recognize them as well.
I've had personal experience in New Hampshire with Elaine Connor's Wildlife.
Yes.
What an awesome place. Have you heard of that?
Yes, I know Kathy, the director there, and she's very successful at fawn and moose calf rehab,
Oh, I didn't
among
know.
other animals.
Moose too?
Yes.
Interesting. Adam Mirkowski, a Vermont Fish and Wildlife biologist, has claimed that fawn need their mother's guidance to survive. Is that true, Julia?
Well, the rehabbers on the panel know more about it than I do, but I've spoken at length with Donna and also with Kathy Gregg at the center in New Hampshire, and what I hear, and also a wonderful woman who rehabbed deer for years in New York, and all of them have said that deer can easily either rejoin a herd or just or can manage after they're released. So these folks can fill in
Well, you're right.
fill in the gaps.
You're right.
Donna probably knows
And
better
even
than I do.
a fawn, even 3 weeks old, will begin to graze, and eventually graze more. They know what to take. I've seen young fawn pawing into the soil and mouthing it, and I'm assuming looking for minerals and salts. Much of what they need to do for survival is instinctual.
Well,
Right.
if you speak to them, do they get to know you and become tame? I mean, Donna, can you answer that?
No, I think that has been a concern of the commissioners, is that we would be releasing tame deer. And an animal, if it is given the choice and the tools it needs, will want to be wild. It will seek being wild. And when I mention seeing a fawn in the wild and speaking to it, it means if I step out onto my porch and I just speak to them, rather than a wild deer bolting when they hear that door opening, fawn that have been rehabilitated will pause, and their ears might come up and they'll look at you, and you realize who they are. They still run, they still want to be in the wild. You can't approach them, and
Right.
they're not pets, but they react slightly differently than a wild deer for the first, perhaps the first couple seasons that they're free.
And can I add something to that?
Sure.
I think this is an important point, that there is a great concern from the Fish and Game Department that these wild animals not be treated as pets. And I was portrayed as someone who was trying to make a pet of the fawn that I had, which was not at all the case. And I believe Patrick Berry knew that that wasn't the case. But there is a concern about that, and I think that fawns could become very attached to humans if they were treated in a way that allowed them to become a pet. So to my mind, this is what you don't want to see happen. You don't want to see people like me and other caring citizens of Vermont feel that they have no one to guide them, no one to call on that can help. And here they have this fawn. They don't want to call Fish and Game because Fish and Game will shoot it. The wildlife community says, we can't help you. And then they just are left on their own to do the best that they can, and they really don't have the training to know to keep at a distance from the fawn and not make the fawn to encourage the fawn becoming a pet. And to my mind, I think the Fish and Game Department is more likely to set up an unfortunate situation. Apparently, male deer can be dangerous if they're made pets than when they later go into their rutting season, I think it's called. So, you know, wouldn't you want people, caring, kind people, to be able to call people who are experts, who know how to care for these animals and get them back to the wild, rather than people feeling like they either have a choice of listening to this fawn starve to death or have them shot, or just try to do it themselves, which doesn't seem, or transport the fawn across state lines, which I know the Fish and Game doesn't think is a great solution either.
I don't know if that's legal.
It is not
It's
legal.
not legal.
I didn't think it was.
Right.
It's not legal.
So, okay, we have an awful lot more to talk about on this same subject, but we have to close now. But please, our following show will be part 2 of fawn rehabilitation and a way to change the policy within Vermont. Thank you very much for watching For the Animals, and join us again next week.
At dusk, there came a turning. There was a moment when all was known. You could feel